The rider pulled his horse to a hard stop in the middle of Caldwell Street, dust billowing up around the animal's hooves like a small storm announcing itself. And Graham Carver stepped off the boardwalk with the kind of slow, deliberate movement that told every man watching from the saloon window and the general store doorway that this was not going to end well for the man on the horse. "I have a message for Marcella Talmadge," the rider said, holding up a sealed envelope as if its very existence granted him some kind of authority. He was young, maybe 20, with a fresh face that hadn't yet learned what trouble looked like when it walked toward you wearing a sheriff's badge. Graham Carver reached up and took the envelope from the rider's hand in one smooth motion. He didn't open it. He didn't look at it. He looked directly at the rider with eyes the color of a sky just before a tornado, pale gray and utterly without mercy. "She is not receiving messages from that man," Graham said, his voice carrying the particular quiet that was louder than shouting, "now or ever again." The rider blinked. "Sir, I was paid good money to deliver. Ride back the way you came," Graham said. "Tell whoever hired you that the message didn't arrive. Tell him the road was washed out. Tell him whatever you need to tell him to keep yourself out of the business of a dangerous man. But understand this clearly." He held the envelope at eye level between them. "This does not reach her." The rider looked at the envelope, looked at the badge on Graham's chest, looked at the two deputies who had appeared on either flank of the street without anyone quite noticing when they had done so, and made the kind of decision that young men make when survival finally outweighs a delivery fee. He turned his horse around and rode back south. Graham Carver watched him go. Then he walked back onto the boardwalk and stood there alone for a long moment, the envelope still in his hand, and something moved across his face that had nothing to do with professional duty and everything to do with the woman currently sitting inside the Talmadge dry goods store 3 buildings down, arranging bolts of calico fabric, as if the ordinary business of an ordinary Tuesday could hold together a life that had been cracking at the seams for 6 months. He pressed the envelope into his coat pocket. He would burn it later. But first, he needed to think about how everything had brought them to this moment, and why protecting Marcella Talmadge had become the thing around which every other duty in his life now orbited. It had started, as so many things in the town of Harrow Creek, Kansas, started with an arrival. Harrow Creek sat on the edge of the Flint Hills in the autumn of 1878, a town that had survived cattle drives, drought, and 2 separate outbreaks of fever to become something that almost deserved the word permanent. It had a main street with a proper wooden boardwalk. It had a bank, a hotel called the Drover's Rest, a livery, a blacksmith, a school that ran 4 days a week, a church with a bell that actually worked, and the Talmadge dry goods store, which had been there since 1871 when Cornelius Talmadge had driven a wagon full of merchandise west from St. Louis and decided that the flat Kansas horizon was exactly the kind of place where a man could build something real. Cornelius had built it. And then, in the spring of 1878, Cornelius had died of a heart failure that took him in his sleep, quietly and without drama, which was the only quiet and undramatic thing that had happened to the Talmadge family in the year that followed. Because Cornelius had not died alone in his circumstances. He had died with a daughter, 24 years old, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, and possessed of a stubbornness that the town alternately admired and found exhausting, who now owned the store outright, and with a debt that Cornelius had apparently taken on in his final year, a debt that he had hidden from his daughter with the particular skill of a man who believed he would have time to solve his own problems before they became anyone else's. The man to whom the debt was owed was named Aldous Fenn, and Aldous Fenn was the man whose messages Graham Carver had just refused to let reach Marcella Talmadge. Graham had not been the sheriff of Harrow Creek when Cornelius Talmadge died. He had arrived 3 months after that event, transferred by the county seat to replace a sheriff who had retired, and he had ridden into town on a bay horse with a single saddlebag and a reputation that preceded him from his years in Dodge City, where he had served as a deputy under a marshal whose name people still said with a particular kind of respect. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that was starting to show the first threads of gray at the temples, and a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something that was not classically handsome, but was nevertheless the kind of face that people remembered. He had a scar that ran along his jaw from an incident he did not discuss, and he had the habit of going very still when he was paying close attention to something, a stillness that made him seem either completely relaxed or completely dangerous, depending on what he was paying attention to. He had noticed Marcella Talmadge on his second day in Harrow Creek. Not in the way of a man who immediately considers romantic possibilities, but in the way of a man whose professional instincts are constantly cataloging the people around him. She was running the store alone. She was clearly intelligent, clearly capable, and she was also clearly afraid of something that she was working very hard not to show. He recognized that particular quality because he had seen it many times before, the way a person's jaw sets just slightly too firmly, the way their eyes move to the door when it opens even in the middle of a conversation, the way they calculate the distance between themselves and an exit without appearing to do so. He had asked Deputy Miles Holt about her on his fourth day in town. Miles Holt was a solid, unimaginative man of 42 who had been keeping order in Harrow Creek for 11 years and who dispensed local knowledge with the economy of someone who had learned that words were a limited resource. Cornelius Talmadge's girl, Miles had said, runs the store now, smart as a whip, got a situation with Aldous Fenn. What kind of situation? Graham had asked. Miles had looked at him with an expression that conveyed the complexity of a subject that his economy of words was not equal to. The kind, he finally said, where a man who is owed money has decided he would prefer to be owed something else entirely. That was when Graham Carver had understood the shape of the problem. He had not gone to Marcella directly. He had instead done what he always did when he arrived in a new jurisdiction, which was to observe and gather information before acting, because the fastest way to make a dangerous situation worse was to insert yourself into it before you understood its architecture. What he learned over the following 2 weeks was this. Aldous Fenn was a land speculator and occasional money lender based out of Wichita, about 40 miles south of Harrow Creek. He was 53 years old, twice widowed, moderately wealthy, and possessed of a reputation that contained the word predatory in every telling of it regardless of who was doing the telling. He had lent Cornelius Talmadge $800 against the store property, at a rate of interest that was either aggressive or unconscionable depending on your interpretation of the arrangement, and Cornelius had died before repaying $1 of principal, which meant that, with the accumulated interest, the sum now stood at something close to $1,100. $1,100 was not a sum that Marcella Talmadge had available. The store was profitable enough to sustain her and to pay wages to her one employee, a 16-year-old boy named Denny Marsh who swept floors and made deliveries, but it was not profitable enough to retire a debt of that size in any time frame that Aldous Fenn was willing to accept. What Aldous Fenn was willing to accept, according to every rumor that moved through Harrow Creek like water through dry ground, was Marcella herself. Not her hand in the formal courtship and proposal sense, though he dressed his intentions in that clothing when he came to town. The rumor, which Miles Holt confirmed with one of his eloquent silences, was that Fenn had made it clear to Marcella that her options were to marry him and have the debt considered settled, or to lose the store to foreclosure and find herself with no livelihood and no home. It was, in the bluntest possible terms, a trap. A trap laid with the appearance of generosity and the mechanism of desperation, the kind of trap that worked because it left the person inside it unable to cry for help without admitting to a vulnerability that pride and survival instinct both forbade. Graham had gone to see Marcella Talmadge on a Wednesday afternoon in late June, 3 weeks after arriving in Harrow Creek. He had waited until the store was empty of other customers, which was a patience that cost him 40 minutes of standing across the street pretending to have nothing in particular to do, and then he had walked in and introduced himself properly. She had looked at him with those dark eyes that were doing their careful, involuntary calculation, and she had said, "I know who you are, Sheriff Carver. Everyone in Harrow Creek knows who you are by now." "Then you know I'm here to keep order," he had said. "Everyone says you're very good at that," she had replied, in a tone that was polite and entirely noncommittal, and that somehow managed to communicate, without saying so, that she was not currently interested in being kept in any kind of order. He had bought a box of matches and a length of rope and left without saying any of the things he had intended to say, because the conversation had not gone the direction he had planned, and because something about Marcella Talmadge made him feel, for the first time in a long time, like he was operating without a complete map. He went back the next day, and the day after that. He had legitimate reasons each time, because the dry goods store was where you bought the things that daily life in 1878 Kansas required, and a sheriff had as much need of matches and rope and lamp oil and writing paper as anyone else. But the reasons were also transparently excuses, and by the end of the first week of these visits, something had shifted in the quality of Marcella's attention when he came through the door. She was still careful. She was still measuring him against some internal standard that he could not read. But there was a moment, on the 6th visit, when she was showing him 2 different grades of leather cord, and explaining the difference in their durability with a precision and earnestness that suggested she had decided to treat him as a serious customer rather than a social obligation, and he had found himself watching her hands move over the cord, and thinking with a clarity that surprised him that he had not been this interested in another person in a very long time. He had asked her that day how the store was doing. She had paused. Just a fraction of a second, just the briefest moment before she recomposed herself into the confident proprietress version of Marcella Talmadge, but he had seen it. The pause, the recalibration, the choice. "The store is doing well, thank you," she had said, and he had said very quietly, "Miss Talmadge, I am not asking as a social courtesy. I am asking because I think something is wrong and I would like to know if I can help." The silence that followed that statement was one of the longer silences Graham Carver had ever sat inside. He watched her eyes move through a series of internal arguments, watched the pride and the caution and something that looked very much like exhaustion wage their brief, quiet war, and then she had set down the leather cord and said, "Not here. Not in the store." They had walked that evening to the creek bank at the north end of town, where cottonwood trees had grown in over the years into something that almost resembled shade, and Marcella had sat on a flat rock and told him everything. She told it without drama and without self-pity, which made it more affecting than either of those things would have been. She laid out the facts with the precision of someone who had been alone with them for too long, who had examined them from every angle and found no solution and was now, finally, admitting to another human being that the examination had not produced one. The debt, Fenn's terms, the timeline, the alternatives which she had catalogued with the thoroughness of someone who had not left any of them unexplored and which had all terminated in the same dead end. "He comes to town every 3 weeks, she said. "He presents himself as a prospective suitor. He is perfectly polite in public. He makes sure that everyone sees him as a reasonable man who has been patient with a young woman in difficult circumstances." She paused. "And in private, he makes it very clear that the patience is not indefinite." Graham had listened to all of this without interrupting her, and when she finished, he had been quiet for a moment, because he was already seeing the shape of what this situation actually was, which was not just a debt and a threat but a carefully constructed system of pressure, designed to make Marcella feel that there was no legitimate avenue of recourse, that the law could not help her because no law had technically been broken, that her pride and reputation kept her from public appeal. And that time was reliably working against her. It was the kind of trap that worked because it was patient. "How much time do you have?" he asked. "He has given me until the end of October," she said. "That's 4 months. 4 months." Graham had turned that over in his mind. Then he had said, "I want you to understand something, Miss Talmadge. I am telling you this as a matter of fact and not as a promise of anything beyond my professional capacity. No one is going to force you into anything. That is not going to happen in my jurisdiction." She had looked at him then in a way she had not looked at him before, with something unguarded and undefended, and he had felt the weight of that look in a place that was nowhere near professional. "You can't stop a legal debt," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I can investigate the terms of how it was made, and whether the rate of interest is legal under Kansas statute, and whether Fenn's lending practices in general have involved any conduct that the law has opinions about. Because men who build traps like this one rarely build only one, and the bait is never only one person." She had stared at him for a long time. Then she had said, very quietly, "Thank you." It was not a declaration. It was not a beginning, not in the way that anyone watching from outside would have described it. But Graham Carver walked back to the sheriff's office that evening with the sense that something had changed in the architecture of his days, that there was now a gravity operating in his life that had not been there before, and that it was pulling in the direction of the woman who had just, for the first time in months, allowed herself to exhale. He wrote to the county courthouse in Wichita that same night. He wrote to a former colleague in Dodge City who had dealt with Fenn's type before and might know something useful. He pulled out the Kansas statutes on money lending and read them by lamplight until his eyes burned, and he found, buried in language that required patience to follow, that the interest rate Fenn had charged Cornelius Talmadge was, in fact, 2 percentage points above the maximum allowed by statute. It was not a large number, but a violation was a violation. He also found, in correspondence with his Dodge City contact over the following 3 weeks, that Aldous Fenn had been involved in 2 previous debt arrangements with widowed or otherwise vulnerable property owners, both of which had resulted in foreclosures that Fenn had then purchased at below market value and resold at significant profit. Neither of those arrangements had involved anything demonstrably illegal, but they formed a pattern, and patterns had a way of eventually resolving into evidence. None of this happened quickly, because nothing in the legal process of 1878 Kansas happened quickly. Letters took 4 days to arrive and 4 days to be answered, and the county courthouse was a place where things moved at the pace of bureaucratic self-protection rather than urgency. Graham understood this. He had worked within systems that moved slowly his whole professional life, and he had learned that impatience was the thing that caused the most mistakes. But while the legal machinery moved at its own pace, something else was moving at a pace that had nothing to do with patience or professional calculation. He had begun to look forward to the mornings. Specifically, he had begun to look forward to the mornings because they were when Marcella Talmadge opened the store, and because the store was on the same side of the street as the sheriff's office, 2 buildings down, and because there was a window in the sheriff's office that faced the street, and because Graham Carver, who had spent years training himself not to be distracted from work by anything, had discovered that a particular dark-haired woman arranging her storefront display each morning at 7:45 had become the single most effective distractor he had encountered in his adult life. He did not indulge this. He noticed it, acknowledged it internally with the same honesty he applied to everything else, and then he went back to work. But it was there. Every morning it was there. Their meetings at the Creek Bank had continued. They were not romantic meetings, or not formally so. They were conversations about the situation, updates on what Graham had found, questions that Marcella had about what her legal options actually were. She was precise and intelligent, and she asked good questions, and she pushed back on his interpretations when she thought he was oversimplifying, which happened more than he had expected, and which he found more stimulating than he was prepared to admit. She had a way of thinking that was entirely practical, anchored in the facts immediately in front of her, but also capable of holding two contradictory possibilities at once without needing to resolve them prematurely. He had met very few people with that capacity. Most people needed things to be settled before they could act, needed certainty before they could commit. Marcella Talmadge seemed to operate from a place of fundamental comfort with ambiguity, as if she had learned long ago that the world did not organize itself into certainties for anyone's convenience, and the only sensible response was to keep moving anyway. He had told her so one evening, sitting on the flat rock with the last of the summer light going gold through the cottonwoods. She had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "My father was a very certain man. He was always sure about everything. He was sure the debt would work itself out. He was sure I would marry before he died and that someone else would be responsible for the store. He was sure that the future would accommodate itself to his preferences." She paused. "I decided when I was about 12 years old that certainty was a form of laziness." Graham had looked at her and felt something give way inside him, some last wall of professional distance, and he had said, "You are the most interesting person I have met in a very long time, Marcella." It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed it. He saw her notice it, saw the slight involuntary softening around her eyes, and then she had looked away toward the creek and said nothing for a moment, and the silence between them had the quality of something settling into a new shape. "You should be careful," she said finally, not looking at him. "Of what?" he asked. "Of being kind to me right now," she said. "I am in a position where kindness from the right person could make me very foolish." It was the most honest thing she had said to him, and probably the most honest thing she had said to anyone since her father died. Graham understood that. He also understood that she had said it as a warning to herself as much as to him. "I am not trying to be kind," he said. "I am trying to be accurate." She had turned back to him then, and the look that passed between them was not the look of two people who had not yet acknowledged what was happening. It was the look of two people who had acknowledged it completely, internally, and were now deciding together, without words, to be careful about it, to protect it by not rushing it, to not allow what was between them to become a vulnerability that the situation they were both inside could exploit. It was, in its way, a deeply mature decision. It was also, Graham reflected later, walking back to the office in the blue September dusk, an exquisite form of torture. The first of Aldous Fenn's personal visits came in mid-July. Graham had known it was coming. Miles had told him that Fenn usually came on the second Tuesday of each month, and he had made a point of being visible on the main street that day without making himself conspicuous about it. Fenn arrived in a good buggy with a driver, a man in his 50s with a well-fitted suit, and the particular kind of self-presentation that came from money that was real but not old, that still needed to announce itself. Graham watched from the boardwalk as Fenn went into the dry goods store. He waited. He counted the minutes. When 20 minutes had passed, he crossed the street and walked into the store. Fenn was standing on the customer side of the counter, which was tactically appropriate, positioning himself as a visitor rather than a creditor. Marcella was behind the counter, and she had her hands flat on the surface in front of her, a position that Graham recognized as something she used when she needed to steady herself, when she needed the solid reality of a physical surface to keep her grounded. "Sheriff Carver," she said, and her voice was entirely level. "Mr. Fenn was just leaving." Fenn had turned at Graham's entrance with the smoothness of a man who had long practice at not showing surprise. He was heavier than Graham had expected from his description, with a florid face and careful eyes that did the rapid calculation of a man who was always assessing advantage. "Sheriff," Fenn said, "I was not aware Harrow Creek had acquired new law." 3 months ago, Graham said pleasantly. He moved to the counter as if he were simply there to make a purchase and said to Marcella, "Do you have that lamp oil I ordered, Miss Talmadge?" She reached under the counter and produced a bottle that she had not previously taken an order for, because there was no order, and set it down with a composure that impressed him deeply. "I was telling Miss Talmadge," Fenn said, as if the conversation were continuing between the three of them on equal terms, that I hope we can arrive at a conclusion to our arrangement soon. The timeline she was given is approaching. I imagine Miss Talmadge will let you know her decision when she has made it, Graham said, picking up the bottle of oil and taking a coin from his pocket. Given that this is her store and her decision, and that she is a capable adult woman entirely able to manage her own affairs. The emphasis was gentle, the meaning was not. Fenn smiled, which was the expression of a man who had won enough confrontations to find them entertaining. Of course, he said. I look forward to hearing from you, Marcella. He used her given name with a familiarity that was both calculated and aggressive. Good day, Sheriff. He left. Graham set the coin on the counter and picked up the lamp oil he didn't need and looked at Marcella, who was still standing with her hands flat on the surface and whose color was slightly off, the particular pallor of someone who has been under sustained pressure and is holding it together by force of will. Are you all right? He asked. No, she said, and then immediately, yes, I'm fine. You don't have to be fine, he said. In here I do, she said, where anyone can see. He understood that. The store was not a private space. The store was where she was the proprietress, the capable, unfazed businesswoman, the woman who had taken over her father's legacy without missing a beat. The store was where she could not afford to look afraid or overwhelmed or close to crying, because if she did, the town's perception of her competence would shift, and competence was the only currency she had right now. Walk with me tonight, he said. The creek. She nodded, just barely, and he left. That evening she had cried, briefly, sitting on the flat rock. Not from self-pity, but from the particular release that comes when the pressure is finally and privately acknowledged. And Graham had sat beside her close enough that their shoulders nearly touched and had not offered words, because there were no words for what she was carrying, and the thing she needed most was simply to not be alone with it. When she was done, she had straightened her back and wiped her face with the kind of brisk efficiency that she applied to everything and had said, I hate him. That's reasonable, Graham had said. I hate that my father did this to me, she said. I hate that he died owing a man like that money and didn't tell me. I hate that I am 24 years old and I am stuck in this. She paused. And I hate that I needed to say all of that to someone. Why do you hate that? Graham asked. She looked at him sideways. Because it means I need something from you, and I'm not comfortable needing things from people. Because of what happens when the person isn't there anymore, he said quietly, thinking of her father. She went very still. Then she said, yes. They sat for a while in a silence that was not empty. Then Graham had said, I need you to understand something, Marcella. What I am doing to help with this situation is professional. It is within my responsibilities as sheriff, and it would be happening regardless of any personal, he paused, navigating the word carefully, any personal dimension of our acquaintance. I need you to know that, because I think you need to know that you are not obligated to me, and I need to know that you know that. She had been quiet for a long time. Then she had said, that is the most complicated way anyone has ever told me they are not trying to take advantage of me. He had laughed. It surprised him. He was not a man who laughed easily, and the laugh that came out of him then was genuine and startled, and she had turned to look at him with an expression that was surprised as well, as if the laugh had shown her something she had not expected, some crack in the professional edifice that revealed an actual human being underneath. She had smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile with something that reached all the way to her eyes. Graham, she said, and then stopped. It was the first time she had used his name. He had felt it like a physical thing. Yes, he said. Thank you, she said, for all of it. He walked her back to the store, which she lived above in the 2 rooms that constituted her domestic life, and he stood on the boardwalk, watching the light come on in the upstairs window after she went inside, and he stood there longer than any professional reason required, and when he finally turned and walked back to the office he was aware, with a clarity that was both exhilarating and frightening, that he was in serious trouble. The investigation into Fenn's lending practices was proceeding with the slow momentum of legal process. The county courthouse had acknowledged the statutory violation in the interest rate and had opened an inquiry. But inquiries were not resolutions, and the inquiry could take months. Graham's contact in Dodge City had sent additional information. A woman named Harriet Cowles who had lost her property to a Fenn foreclosure 2 years earlier, and who was willing to provide testimony if a formal case were assembled. A property in Ellis County that Fenn had acquired under similar circumstances. A clerk in Wichita who handled Fenn's paperwork, and who had apparently made certain comments to certain people that suggested the records were not entirely clean. It was building towards something. Graham could feel it, but it was not there yet, and Marcella's timeline was running. He did not tell her everything he had found, not all at once, because information without a plan to act on it was just anxiety with a specific shape. He told her what was relevant to each stage of the situation, and he watched her absorb it and think about it, and ask the precise questions that indicated she had understood it, and he respected her enough to answer those questions fully rather than shielding her from the complexity. August passed. The Kansas heat was total and without apology, and the main street of Harrow Creek shimmered in the afternoons like a mirage of itself, and Graham moved through his days with the doubled attention of a man managing 2 parallel urgencies: the professional task of building a legal case, and the personal task of not letting what he felt for Marcella Talmadge outpace the situation they were both inside. He was not always successful at the second part. There was an evening in late August when he had come by the store near closing time and found her attempting to move a crate of cast iron pans that was significantly heavier than she had anticipated, and he had come around the counter and lifted it, and she had said, "I had it," and he had said, "I know you did," and they had been standing approximately 12 inches apart in the half-light of the empty store. And the moment had stretched itself out to a length that was considerably beyond what moving a crate required, and Marcella had looked at him with those dark eyes that were no longer measuring exits and said, quietly, "This is complicated." "Yes," he agreed. "I don't want it to be complicated," she said. "I want it to be simple. I want to be a person who is not in debt to a man who is trying to take my home, and I want to—" She stopped. "Want to what?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. She looked at him. The look said everything. And then she took a small, deliberate step backward and said, "Put the crate by the door, please. I'll have Denny move it in the morning." He put the crate by the door. He said good night. He went back to his office and sat at his desk in the dark for a while, not working, just sitting with the shape of what was building between them and what it meant. Fenn's second visit came in mid-August, and this one was less pleasant. He came alone, without his driver, late on a Friday afternoon when the store would have been quiet, and Graham, who had made a habit of keeping closer watch on Tuesdays and Fridays after the first visit, had been there within 7 minutes of Fenn going in. He had heard Fenn's voice before he opened the door, not the smooth, social tone of the first visit, but something lower and more direct. The voice of a man who had decided pleasantness had run its course. He had opened the door without knocking because it was a public storefront, and the way Marcella's eyes moved to him when he entered told him that his timing was not unwelcome. Fenn had turned again, and this time the assessment in his careful eyes was less entertainment and more irritation. "Sheriff," he said, "you seem to make a habit of being in this store." "I seem to make a habit of needing supplies," Graham said. "It's that kind of job." "I was in the middle of a private conversation," Fenn said. "This is a public business establishment," Graham said. "There's no such thing as a private conversation in it." The muscles in Fenn's jaw had tightened visibly. "Miss Talmadge has until the end of October," he said, directing the statement at Graham as much as at Marcella, which was itself a revealing choice. "If an arrangement is not made by then, I will be forced to exercise my legal right to recover the debt through foreclosure." "I'm aware of that timeline," Graham said. "Miss Talmadge is as well. I believe she'll manage it." Fenn looked at him for a long moment. The look contained a question that he was too careful to ask directly. He left. Marcella let out a breath. "He's getting impatient," she said. "Impatient men make mistakes," Graham said. She looked at him. Do you actually have something that will work in time?" He paused. He was not a man who made promises he wasn't certain he could keep, but he was also not a man who left people to drown in uncertainty when there was legitimate reason for hope. "Yes," he said, "I think so, but I need a little more time." She nodded. She trusted him. He felt the weight of that trust like something physical, like something he would carry willingly but not lightly. September arrived with a change in the Kansas weather, the brutal heat giving way to days that were still warm but had something in the air that promised the season was turning. And Harrow Creek began its autumn routine of preparations and business that came before the hard months. Graham sent 2 more letters to Wichita and received one back that contained the information he had been waiting for. The Wichita clerk, whose name was Thomas Oakes, had sent a careful, slightly frightened letter that contained references to 3 additional lending arrangements that Finn had made in the previous 5 years, all of which showed the same pattern of statutory interest violations, and one of which had involved a forgery of a signature on a modification agreement that Oakes had personally witnessed, and which, if it could be substantiated, crossed from civil violation into criminal conduct. Graham read that letter 3 times. He wrote back to Oakes immediately, carefully, asking for specifics and for Oakes' willingness to make a formal statement. He wrote to the county sheriff in Wichita, who had professional authority over Finn in that jurisdiction, and outlined what he had. He wrote to Harriet Cowles in Dodge City and asked her to document her account as formally as she could manage. The machinery was moving. It was still moving slowly, but it was moving. He told Marcella at the creek bank on a September Thursday, with the light going amber and the cottonwood leaves beginning their first experiments with gold, and he watched her face as he laid it out, the statutory violation, the pattern, the possible forgery, the witnesses being assembled. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Is this enough?" she asked. "To stop the foreclosure?" "Yes." If the county courthouse moves on the statutory violation, the debt itself becomes legally challenged, and Finn cannot foreclose on a contested debt without a court hearing. That will take longer than October. "And beyond that?" she asked. "The forgery?" "That depends on Oakes," he said. "He's scared. A lot depends on whether he is scared enough of what Finn might do to him if this comes out, or scared enough of what it means to have witnessed a crime and said nothing." "Which way do you think it will go?" she asked. "I think," Graham said carefully, "that men who watch crimes being committed and say nothing are carrying something very heavy, and that they are often looking for a legitimate reason to put it down." She looked at him. "Is that from experience?" "Some things are from experience," he said. She turned to look at the creek, and after a moment she said, "Graham, if this works, if the debt is resolved, if Finn is dealt with." She paused. What happens then? The question hung in the evening air. It was not about the legal situation. They both knew that. Graham was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been trying to be very careful not to make this more complicated for you than it already is." "I know," she said. "Because I am aware," he continued, "that I am in a position of authority and you are in a position of vulnerability, and that those 2 things create a situation where any feelings—" He paused, choosing his words with an attention that would have seemed excessive in any other context but felt exactly right in this one, "where any feelings that develop need to be treated with a great deal of honesty and care." She turned to look at him. "Yes," she said, "they do. So I will be honest," he said. "What happens then, if this is resolved, is that I would like very much to know you as you actually are, rather than as you are under these circumstances. Because I suspect that those are 2 different things, and I find the person I have seen under these circumstances, the person who is carrying all of this with the courage and intelligence you have shown, I find that person extraordinary, and I would like to find out what she is like when she is not carrying all of this." Marcella looked at him for a long time. The light was fading. The creek moved softly below them. "That," she said finally, "is probably the most thoughtful thing anyone has ever said to me." "It's the truth," he said. She reached out and put her hand briefly over his where it rested on the rock, just for a moment. Then she took it away and stood up and said, "We should go back." He stood up. They walked back toward town in the September dusk, not touching, not talking, but with the full awareness of two people who are moving through a shared space with a care that comes from knowing that what is between them is something worth protecting. October arrived, and with it the pressure that Marcella had been living inside for months reached its final tightening. 3 weeks remained until the deadline Finn had set. Graham had received confirmation from the county courthouse in Wichita that the inquiry into the statutory interest violation was proceeding. He had received a formal witness statement from Harriet Cowles. He had received, in the first week of October, a longer and considerably more frightened letter from Thomas Oakes, which contained enough specific detail about the forged document to make it actionable. He took all of this to the county seat himself, riding the 40 miles to Wichita on a Monday morning, and spending the day with the county judge and the county sheriff laying out what he had assembled. It was a long day of legal conversation conducted in the particular language of men who must be precise about what the law will and will not do, and at the end of it, Graham had come away with two things. First, a court order challenging the legality of the debt agreement and requiring Finn to appear before the county court before any foreclosure action could proceed, which effectively suspended Finn's timeline indefinitely. Second, a warrant for Aldous Finn's arrest on charges of document forgery in connection with the Ellis County lending arrangement, which was the more serious matter, and which Thomas Oakes had now formally provided evidence to support. He rode back to Harrow Creek on Tuesday morning, arriving in the early afternoon, and he went straight to the dry goods store. Marcella was behind the counter with Denny, who was doing something complicated with shelving that seemed to require more assistance from his employer than the task strictly required. Denny was 16 and had made no particular secret of the fact that he thought working for Marcella Talmadge was approximately the best situation anyone of his age could be in, and Graham felt for the boy a mild and thoroughly unprofessional sympathy. "Denny," he said, "there's a delivery at the livery that Mrs. Perkins has been waiting 2 days for. Would you mind checking on that?" Denny looked at Marcella. Marcella nodded. Denny left with the celerity of someone who had learned not to argue with the sheriff. Graham set the court order on the counter. Marcella looked at it. She read it again. Then she looked up at him. "This stops him," she said. "This stops the foreclosure," he confirmed. "The debt is legally challenged. He cannot touch the store until the court has ruled, and that process will take months, during which his other conduct will be examined, and the forgery charges will be prosecuted, and I am confident that by the time the court has finished with him, he will have considerably more pressing concerns than an $1,100 debt in Harrow Creek." She was very still. Then something happened in her face, something he had not seen there before, a complete and unguarded release, the collapse of months of sustained control, and her eyes filled with tears that she did not blink away. "It's over," she said. "The worst of it," he said gently. "Yes." She put both hands over her face. He stood on the other side of the counter and did not reach for her, because the counter was between them, and because she was processing something enormous and she needed a moment to do that, and because respecting that was what you did for a person you genuinely cared about rather than a person you wanted to need you. After a moment she lowered her hands. She had steadied herself. Her eyes were still bright with what had been tears, and her face was still slightly undone in the way that relief produces, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life, and he did nothing with that information except hold it quietly in the part of himself that he kept very still. "Thank you," she said. "Graham, thank you." "You are welcome," he said. She looked at him. Then she said, "Come to supper on Sunday." It was not what he had expected her to say. He had expected more processing, more careful navigation of the space between them. He had not expected her to simply, cleanly open a door. "The store is closed Sundays," she continued, with a composure that might have been confidence or might have been her best performance of it. "I cook upstairs on Sunday evenings. I would like you to come." Yes, he said. She nodded. She picked up the court order and folded it carefully as if it were something precious, which it was. Then she looked at him once more and said, 6 o'clock. He left. Outside on the boardwalk, he stood in the October sun, and did not bother to manage whatever expression was on his face, because the street was momentarily empty, and there was no one to be professional for. He went back to his office and sat down and looked at nothing for a while, and then he went back to work because there were still things to be done. The writer arrived the following Thursday. He was young, maybe 20, with a fresh face and an official-looking envelope, and he pulled his horse to a stop in the middle of Caldwell Street and asked a man passing where he could find Marcella Talmadge. Graham had been on the boardwalk. He had heard the name. He had walked over with the slow, deliberate movement that he had learned communicated authority without urgency, and he had asked the writer who had sent him. The writer had held up the envelope. "Mr. Aldous Fenn of Wichita, sir." He asked that this be delivered personally to. Graham had taken the envelope. He had looked at the writer and delivered the information that he needed the writer to have, in the clearest and most unambiguous possible terms. "She is not receiving messages from that man," he said, "now or ever again." And when the writer was gone, Graham stood on the boardwalk with the envelope in his hand and thought about burning it without reading it. He considered this for a moment, and then decided that professional integrity required him to know what was in it before he destroyed it, in case it contained anything relevant to the legal proceedings. He went to the office and opened it. It was not relevant to the legal proceedings. It was a private letter, 2 pages in Fenn's handwriting, and it was the kind of letter that a man who is watching his control over a situation dissolve writes when he is angry and frightened, and has decided that sentiment can be deployed as a weapon. It moved from appeals to Marcella's sense of obligation, to her memory of her father's debt as a matter of family honor, to insinuations about what the town would think of a woman who had clearly been spending considerable time in the company of the sheriff, to a final passage that was not a threat in the legal sense but had the shape of one. Graham read it twice. Then he burned it in the stove in the corner of the office, and he sat there and watched it burn, and he thought about what kind of man builds that kind of letter and what it revealed about the desperation behind it, and he concluded that Aldous Fenn had realized, belatedly, that the walls of the trap he had built were closing inward on himself rather than outward on his intended victim. He went to Sunday supper. The 2 rooms above the dry goods store were modest and entirely Marcella. There were books on every flat surface that was not otherwise occupied. There were curtains she had made herself from fabric she clearly liked rather than fabric that was practical. There was a small round table set for 2 with mismatched china that had the look of things assembled over time from whatever was available, which was a specific and particular kind of beauty. There was something cooking that smelled like it had been prepared with care and skill. She was wearing a dress that was not her working dress. It was dark green, and it was not elaborate, but it was clearly chosen with some intention, and the fact of that intention made something warm move through Graham's chest. They ate and they talked, and without the specific pressure of the situation they had been inside, without the careful professional distance, without the flat rock at the creek bank as the only space where they could be themselves, they discovered things about each other that the crisis had not given them room to find. She had read more books than anyone he had met. She had opinions about those books that she held with the same precision and conviction she applied to everything, and she was interested in his opinions and willing to argue with them when she disagreed. She had wanted, at 15, to go to a teacher's college in St. Louis and had not been able to because her mother was ill, and then her father needed help with the store. And she did not tell this with bitterness, but with the matter-of-fact accounting of someone who had made peace with an alternative path while retaining a clear memory of the one not taken. She asked him about Dodge City. He told her stories that he had not told in a long time, things that were funny in retrospect and had not been funny at the time, and she listened with her chin resting on her hand and a quality of attention that made him feel, very simply, seen. "Why did you leave?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I had been there long enough that I was starting to know the outcome of everything before it happened," he said. "And that is when the work stops being useful and starts being repetition. And here," she said. He looked at her. "Here nothing has happened the way I expected it to," he said. "From the first week." She met his eyes and held them, and they both understood completely what he meant. After supper she made coffee, which was a luxury in 1878 Kansas that she had clearly decided was appropriate to the occasion, and they sat across from each other at the small table, and the conversation became quieter, the way conversations do when two people have finished the social portion of an evening and are moving into something more essential. "Are you staying?" she asked. Then she colored slightly. "In Harrow Creek, I mean. Some sheriffs are placed temporarily." "I am not placed temporarily," he said. "I accepted a permanent position with the county. I intend to stay." He paused. "I find I have a reason to." She looked at her coffee cup. A small smile appeared, the kind that people try to suppress and don't entirely succeed. "Marcella," he said. She looked up. "I meant what I said at the creek. I would like to court you properly, with your permission. I would like for us to know each other without this being a crisis we are managing together, and I would like to find out whether what I believe about you and about this," he stopped and started again, "about what I feel is what I think it is." She was quiet for a moment. The lamp on the table made her eyes bright. "I already know what it is," she said, "for my part." "Do you?" he asked. "Yes," she said simply. He reached across the small table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a long time without speaking, and the October wind moved past the windows outside, and inside there was warmth and lamplight, and the quiet that holds two people when they have finally, carefully, arrived at the place they have been moving toward for months. He walked home that night through the cold Kansas dark, with the kind of settled feeling in his chest that he had not had in years, possibly in all his adult life, the feeling of something having been correctly and permanently placed. Fenn appeared in Harrow Creek one final time, 11 days later. He came not in his buggy with his driver, and not with his social manner and his carefully constructed pleasantness, but looking like a man who had received several pieces of bad legal news in rapid succession, and had not slept well as a result. He went to the store in the middle of a weekday morning, and Graham was there within 4 minutes, because Miles Holt had seen Fenn ride in and had come to the office immediately. Fenn was standing at the counter when Graham arrived, and Marcella was standing behind it, and the quality of the confrontation was entirely different from the previous visits. Fenn was not performing reasonableness. He was looking at Marcella with the expression of a man who has realized that the target of his manipulation has slipped entirely out of reach, and who is cycling through the final stages of his plan looking for a purchase point that no longer exists. "I want to speak with her alone," Fenn said when Graham came in. "That is not going to happen," Graham said. "This is a private business matter," Fenn said. "You are subject to a court order in a county that includes this town," Graham said. "There is no private business matter between you and Miss Talmadge until that court order is resolved, and I am here in my professional capacity to ensure that no communication occurs outside of legal channels." He paused. "If you have something to say to Miss Talmadge, say it to her through your attorney in the appropriate court setting." Fenn looked at Marcella. Something moved in his face that was neither anger nor calculation, but something older and darker, the expression of a man who has understood definitively that he has lost. "This is not over," he said. "Yes," Graham said. "It is." Fenn left. He did not come back to Harrow Creek. He appeared in the county court 4 weeks later, where the debt arrangement was ruled partially void due to the statutory interest violation, and reduced to a principal amount that Marcella would be able to retire within 18 months from store revenue. The forgery charges in the Ellis County case resulted in a criminal conviction 6 months later, which effectively ended Fenn's career as a money lender and speculator, and which sent him to face a justice that was entirely legal and entirely appropriate. Harrow Creek did not follow the story with much attention once Fenn stopped being a local presence. The town had its own business to conduct, its own winters to prepare for, its own ongoing life to manage. What it did follow, with the particular attentiveness that small towns apply to the romantic lives of their residents, was the developing courtship of its sheriff and the Talmadge woman. It was conducted with a formality that the town found both old-fashioned and charming. Graham came to Sunday suppers. He escorted Marcella to the church social in November, which was one of the town's major autumn events, and which required approximately 45 minutes of sustained community observation that both of them navigated with more composure than they felt. He brought her books when he came across something in the county seat bookstore that he thought she would like. She brought him food to the office, not every day but regularly, which was the kind of domestic gesture that the town read correctly as a signal that things were proceeding. They walked together in the evenings, not always to the creek bank, but sometimes just along the main street or through the residential parts of town, talking with the ease of two people who had discovered that they were genuinely interested in what the other person thinks. Graham was quieter by nature than Marcella, but he was not a silent man, and with her he talked more freely than he did with anyone else, pulled open by her attention and her intelligence and her particular habit of asking questions that required real answers. He told her about his family, which was from Virginia originally, his father a small farmer who had died when Graham was 17, and his mother who had lived with his sister in St. Louis, whom he saw infrequently, but to whom he wrote regularly. He told her about the incident that had produced the scar on his jaw, which was from a knife fight in his early days as a deputy, and which he had not previously discussed with anyone in Harrow Creek, and he told it to her directly without drama, and she listened without flinching, and without making it larger than it was, which he appreciated enormously. She told him about her childhood in the store, which had been in many ways an unusual one, spending her days surrounded by merchandise and conversation, and the transactional life of a commercial space, developing a knowledge of people and their wants and fears and vanities that had shaped her into someone who read situations very quickly and accurately, which was a skill, she said dryly, that had proven more useful than the teaching certificate she had never gotten. She told him about her mother, who had died when Marcella was 19, a quiet woman who had nonetheless had a spine of iron and a clarity of vision that her daughter recognized as her own primary inheritance. She told him about her father with the complicated honesty of someone who had loved a person and also been failed by that person, who had not yet entirely resolved those two facts but who was trying. He did his best, she said one November evening, the cold having moved in properly now, and both of them wrapped in heavy coats on the boardwalk outside the store, because neither of them had wanted to end the evening, but the sensible thing was to not stay inside indefinitely. I know he did his best. I just wish his best had included telling me the truth about the debt before he died. People hide their failures from the people they love most, Graham said. Because those are the people whose respect they most need to keep. She looked at him. Is that from experience? Yes, he said. She waited. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, my father borrowed money from a man in a situation similar to yours when I was 15. He also didn't tell anyone until he couldn't hide it anymore. We lost a piece of land we'd been farming for 20 years. He paused. I watched my mother's face when she found out. I was 15. I didn't understand yet what I was watching. I understand it now. Marcella was quiet. Then she said, is that why you came to help me? Because of your mother? He considered this honestly. Partly, he said. Beginning. The situation was familiar, the mechanism was familiar, and the unfairness was familiar. But that is not why I continued. No, she agreed softly. I continued, he said, because of you. The winter of 1878 into 1879 settled over Harrow Creek with the implacable flat cold of Kansas winters, and the town contracted into itself as it always did, the days short and the work heavy, and the social life concentrated around warm indoor spaces. Graham's work in winter was quieter than in the driving season, when cattle and cowhands moved through and brought their attendant complications. He spent more time on the administrative tasks that he had let slide during the autumn, and more evenings in Marcella's company, because winter evenings were long, and the store was closed at 5, and the world outside was cold enough to make the alternative unremarkable. They were reading the same book, a novel she had ordered from back east that had arrived in November, and they were discussing it chapter by chapter, which was a form of conversation that suited them both and which had the side effect of requiring them to sit very close together at her small table in order to share the single copy. This arrangement was noted by neither of them out loud. It was noted in several other ways. It was on a January evening, the temperature outside well below freezing, and the stove in Marcella's upstairs rooms doing its best, that Graham Carver did something he had been approaching for 2 months with the same combination of certainty and careful preparation that he brought to everything. They had been talking about the book, and the conversation had drifted as it often did from the book to the subject of the book to the subject behind the subject, and Marcella had said something about the nature of trust, about how it was built not by grand declarations but by the accumulated weight of small, consistent actions. And Graham had set the book down and looked at her and said, "Marcella, I want to ask you something." She looked back at him. "Yes, I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I want to do that, but I want to do it correctly, which means I want to tell you what I am offering first and let you make an informed decision." She blinked. She had not expected this, or not this version of it, not the precision and the seriousness of it. "All right," she said. "I am a sheriff in a small town in Kansas," he said. "It is not always safe work. It is not highly paid work. It requires me to be gone sometimes, and it requires me to be present for other people's crises at inconvenient hours. I am not an easy man in some respects. I am quiet in ways that can be mistaken for distance when they are not distance. I have a past that has not been simple, and there are things in it that I will tell you about in time, because you deserve to know them, but which I cannot lay out all at once." He paused. "What I am also is a man who believes that the person I love is entitled to be fully seen and fully known, and who will not hide things from you out of misplaced protection, because I know what that costs. And what I am is a man who has not felt this certain about anything in his life, and I have felt certain about many things." The stove popped quietly. Outside, the wind moved through Harrow Creek. Marcella looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Graham Carver, you are the most careful, most thoughtful, most quietly impossible man I have ever encountered." "Is that a yes?" he asked. She reached across the small table and took both of his hands in hers, which was a thing she had never done before, and looked at him with the full, unguarded directness that was the most Marcella thing about her, and said, "Yes. It is very much a yes." They were married in March of 1879, in the Harrow Creek church with the bell that actually worked, which rang 9 times for the occasion because Reverend Alcott had a sense of occasion, and an enthusiasm for church bell use that the congregation had long since stopped trying to moderate. The whole town came, because in Harrow Creek a wedding was a community event, and because Marcella Talmadge was one of the town's own, and Graham Carver had, in the 7 months of his sheriffing, become exactly the kind of man that a town wants to see married and settled. Marcella wore a dress of deep ivory that she had made herself over the previous 2 months, with a care and attention that she had described to exactly no one but which was evident in every seam. Graham wore his good suit, and his badge, and had, for the occasion, managed to do something with his hair that suggested effort, which Marcella had noted with private amusement. When Reverend Alcott pronounced them married, Graham had taken her face in his hands and kissed her with a thoroughness that caused a sound from the assembled congregation that was somewhere between a sigh and an approval. And Marcella had put her hands on his chest and kissed him back with equal thoroughness. And the bell rang, and the world was entirely as it should be. They moved into the house that Graham had rented on the north end of town, a proper house with 4 rooms and a yard, because the 2 rooms above the store were adequate for 1 person, and not for 2 people who were serious about building a life. Marcella kept the store, because the store was hers and was going to remain hers, and Graham would not have suggested otherwise even if he had wanted to, which he did not. He walked her to work in the mornings when he could, and he had lunch with her at the store when his work permitted, and he came by in the late afternoons when she was closing up, and the town watched this daily pattern establish itself with the satisfaction of an audience watching something good. The debt to Fenn's estate, reduced by court ruling to its principal, was paid off in full by August of 1879, which was faster than the projected timeline, because Marcella ran the store with a precision and energy that had been somewhat suppressed during the period of the crisis, and which, released from that pressure, expressed itself in the kind of business growth that came from a person finally operating at full capacity. She extended her stock. She negotiated better terms with her suppliers. She made an arrangement with the hotel down the street to supply them with certain staple goods at a reduced but reliable rate. Within a year, the Talmadge dry goods store was doing better business than it had under Cornelius, which Marcella noted with a complicated pride that Graham understood completely. On the autumn evening when she made the final payment and came home and told him, he had opened the bottle of good whiskey he had been saving for a specific occasion, poured 2 glasses, and handed her one with a solemnity that gave way, when their glasses touched, to a smile that was the best version of him, and that she had come to know as the thing she wanted to see every day. "To Cornelius Talmadge," Graham said, "who built something worth protecting." She looked at him. Something moved through her eyes that was love and grief and gratitude all at once. "To Cornelius Talmadge," she said. They drank, and then she put down her glass and put her arms around him, and he held her in the kitchen of their house in Harrow Creek in the autumn of 1879, and the world was quiet and good. She was with child by November. They had not planned it with any particular strategy beyond the natural strategy of 2 people who were very happy with each other. And the news, which came to Marcella's awareness first, and which she communicated to Graham on a cold November morning before either of them had left the house, produced in him a response that she found extremely endearing, which was a brief, complete loss of his characteristic stillness. He had stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at her with an expression that was shock and joy and something that was almost fear all at once. "Are you certain?" he had asked. "I am certain," she said. He had pulled her into his arms with a gentleness that was nonetheless also urgency, and she had felt against her hair that he was laughing, quietly, the same laugh that she had first heard from him on the flat rock at the creek bank in September of 1878. The startled and genuine laugh that was the truest thing about him, and she had laughed too, there in the kitchen, both of them laughing for no reason except that this was happening and it was wonderful. She told him then what she had not said explicitly before, though she thought he knew it, that the thing she had been most afraid of in all of it, in the debt and the threat and the terrible compressed year after her father died, was not losing the store. The store she could have rebuilt, somehow, somewhere. What she had been most afraid of was being alone, being the person who had no one to stand beside her, no one who knew the full truth of what she was facing, no one who chose to stay. He had held her and said nothing for a long time, and then he had said, "I am not going anywhere." She believed him. She believed him in the way you believe something that has been demonstrated rather than merely declared, because every action of every day since October of 1878 had been the same consistent evidence, and she was a woman who trusted evidence. The baby was born in July of 1880, in the hottest week of a hot Kansas summer, with the assistance of the town's doctor, and the neighboring women who arrived with the particular practical efficiency that communities of women bring to each other's births. It was a boy. They named him James Cornelius Carver, James for Graham's father and Cornelius for Marcella's, which was the kind of naming that acknowledged complicated love without simplifying it. Graham had been in the room when James arrived, because Marcella had made it clear that she wanted him there, and the doctor had raised an eyebrow, and then recognized the futility of that particular eyebrow and allowed it. Graham had held her hand through the worst of it and had not flinched, and had not offered useless reassurances, which were the two things Marcella had needed from him most. When James was placed in his arms for the first time, Graham stood very still, the particular stillness that meant he was paying the most careful possible attention, and looked at this new person with an expression that Marcella watched from the bed and would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Hello," Graham said to James, very quietly. James regarded him with the ancient, unfocused solemnity of the newly born. James grew into a child of enormous energy and a total absence of caution, a combination that kept both of his parents comprehensively occupied, and that the town found extremely entertaining, particularly given Graham's characteristic stillness and Marcella's characteristic precision. Their son was neither still nor precise. He was loud and fast and enthusiastic, and absolutely convinced that the world was a fascinating place that existed primarily for his investigation. Graham was a father with the same quality he brought to everything, careful and present and consistent, and Marcella watched him with James and felt a specific variety of love that she had not experienced before, the love of watching someone you love being a good person in a new context. By 1882, James had a sister named Ruth, whose arrival Marcella had announced with the same kitchen before leaving for work method as James's, and Graham had responded with the same loss of stillness, though this time there was more grace in it, a man who knew now what was coming and wanted it rather than a man who was shocked by his own happiness. Ruth was different from her brother in every possible way, quiet and watchful and intensely observational, sitting in corners cataloging the world with her mother's dark eyes, and Graham said, watching her one Sunday morning, "She is going to be very formidable." "She already is," Marcella said. Harrow Creek changed around them as the years moved through their paces, the way small towns in the West were changing in those years, filling in and settling and acquiring the permanence that came from enough years of continuous human attention. More families, a second church, a proper school building that ran 5 days a week with 2 teachers, a newspaper, which arrived in 1881 and which Marcella read cover to cover every week and had opinions about, some of which she sent in the form of letters to the editor that the newspaper printed because they were too precise and well-argued to ignore. Graham served as sheriff for 8 years in total before the county reorganized its jurisdictions, and he was offered a position as county marshal, which was a larger role and required more travel, but which came with a deputy who handled the Harrow Creek work in his absence. He took the position after a long conversation with Marcella in which she asked the right questions, and he answered them honestly, and they concluded together that it was the right move. He was good at the county work, because he brought to it the same combination of legal intelligence and human understanding that had served him in Harrow Creek, and his reputation in the county became what it had been before in Dodge City, the reputation of a man who could be trusted to do the job without corruption or excess. Marcella expanded the store into the building next door in 1883, which Cornelius Talmadge had never done because he had not believed there was sufficient demand, and which Marcella did because she had done the arithmetic and understood that demand existed and was being unmet. She was right, as she generally was about things she had done the arithmetic on, and by 1885, the expanded store was the largest retail establishment between Wichita and Salina, which was a fact that the Harrow Creek newspaper mentioned in an article about the town's commercial development that Marcella read with a satisfaction she was too dignified to express openly, but which Graham recognized in the slightly elevated angle of her chin for the rest of the day. Denny Marsh, who had been sweeping floors and making deliveries at 16, was now 23 and had become the store's manager, which was a development Marcella had planned for, and which Denny had grown into with the particular focus of a young man who understood that he had been given an opportunity and intended to honor it. He was good at the work, and he was devoted to Marcella in the uncomplicated and practical way of someone whose professional development had been entirely shaped by her confidence in him. The flat rock at the creek bank was still there. Marcella had gone back to it sometimes in the early years of their marriage alone, when she needed quiet. Later Graham had come too, and they had sat there in the evenings sometimes in the summer when the children were old enough to be left briefly with a neighbor, the same way they had sat there in 1878 with everything unresolved and the situation pressing in from all sides, but different now. The same place, the same creek, the same cottonwood leaves going gold in September, but the two people sitting there were different in the way that time and love and chosen life make people different, settled into themselves and into each other with the depth that does not come quickly and cannot be manufactured. One September evening in 1885, they were sitting there, both of them past 30 now, the creek moving quietly below them and the light going through its familiar autumn business of making everything briefly perfect, and Marcella said, "Do you remember the first time we sat here?" "Yes," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "Not of you, of being seen to be terrified." "I know," he said. "You were so careful," she said. "So careful with me. I kept waiting for you to push to use what I had told you, and you never did." He looked at her. "Why would I?" "Because men do," she said simply. "It's what they are taught to work with. Vulnerability is a lever." "Not to me," he said. "I know that now," she said. "I knew it then, actually. That was the terrifying part, that I could see you were different, and I didn't know whether to trust what I saw or whether it was something I was manufacturing because I needed it to be true." "Which was it?" he asked. She took his hand. "It was true," she said. He lifted her hand and pressed it briefly to his lips, which was not something he did often and which therefore carried the weight of something deliberate when he did. The last of the light moved through the cottonwood leaves. "I would like," Graham said, "another child." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the creek, and there was something in his profile, in the line of his jaw and the gray at his temples that had expanded from threads to proper silver, that was exactly right in the world. "So would I," she said. He turned to look at her. The smile that moved across his face was the real one, the one she had first seen on this same rock 7 years ago, the one that was still capable of doing something specific to her equilibrium regardless of how many years of shared life had passed. "Then we will," he said. Their third child was a boy, born in the summer of 1886, who they named Thomas, and who arrived with the total ease of a child who had been expected and wanted, and who entered a household already structured around love, and found it entirely to his satisfaction. The debt was gone. Fen was a distant, resolved past that Marcella thought about less and less as the years added their layers. Her father's store was more than he had built it to be. The flat rock at the creek bank was a place she went with her husband in the evenings and felt the particular piece of a life that had been threatened and defended and chosen and built, not handed to anyone, but made, day after day, with the same combination of precision and care and willingness, to be honest, that had shaped both of them before they ever met, and that had, in the end, made them exactly right for each other. Harrow Creek in the late 1880s was no longer quite the town it had been in 1878, when the frontier was still a present reality, and the Flint Hills were full of the sounds of cattle drives, and the particular human noise of a place that was still deciding what it was going to become. It was becoming something more settled, more domestic, more permanent, and that permanence was built in part by the people who had chosen it as their place and had done the work of staying. Graham Carver was one of those people, so was Marcella. And on the evenings when they sat together at the small table in their kitchen, now expanded into a proper dining room that James had grown up eating at, and Ruth had grown up sitting at quietly with her books, and Thomas was currently growing up at with the same enthusiasm he applied to everything. And the lamp made the room warm, and the children were eventually in their beds, and the two of them were alone with the particular quiet that long love makes between people. They were both aware, without needing to say so, of everything that had been required to bring them here. The rider had come and gone. The messages had stopped. The trap had been dismantled. The dark past had been examined and released. The hidden motives had been exposed to the light and withered. The forced choice had turned out not to be a choice at all, because the right person had shown up and stood on the right side of the street and refused to allow the wrong to happen. And out of all of that, out of the betrayal and the fear and the long pressure of a crisis that had pressed two people together and shown them each other's truest selves, something had been built that was stronger than the crisis by exactly the amount that good things are always stronger than the bad things that try to prevent them. Marcella Carver, formerly Talmadge, sat across from her husband in the kitchen of their house in Harrow Creek in the evening of a September day in 1887, and she watched him read the newspaper with the same attention he brought to everything. And she thought about a 24-year-old woman standing with her hands flat on a store counter, trying not to show that she was afraid. And she thought about a man with gray in his hair and a scar on his jaw buying a box of matches he didn't need. And she thought about everything that had moved between those two moments, all the evenings at the creek bank and the Sunday suppers, and the court order laid on the counter, and the October morning when she had watched a rider turn his horse and leave, and known without being told that Graham had sent him away, had stood on that street and closed the door on the last threat and left nothing on the other side of it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked up from the newspaper. He looked at her. The lamp made his eyes pale and bright and entirely familiar, the face she had been looking at for 9 years, and which was, still, the first thing she wanted to see in the morning and the last she wanted to see at night. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just this." He turned his hand over and held hers, and outside the window Harrow Creek went about its evening business, and inside the house their children slept, and the story that had begun with a threatened woman and a careful man on a flat rock by a Kansas creek had arrived, fully and completely, at the place it had always been heading, which was here. This. The table and the lamp and the held hand and the life that had been chosen, piece by piece, with love and courage and a willingness to stand in the street and tell the world, clearly and without apology, that some things are not going to happen. Not now. Not ever again.